that is carrying the body of the late Senator John McCain going through the terrain in Arizona. Sad, very sad, very much Arizona. You could see. Yeah, but go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, he loved being on his ranch there, and that's what Governor Huckabee was talking about with the grilling and the lighter moments. But it was also at where he wanted to go home to Arizona. And, you know, there had been talk when there were some close votes in the Senate some months back, tax cuts and other things. Would he come back to Washington, and how complicated would it be? And he wanted to be home in Arizona. That's where his family was. That's where he really, in all these battles, not just with cancer, but battles in the Senate, you know, he would talk about how Arizona would be a place that would sort of renew him, renew his spirit. It was a great, reinvigorating and a stress reliever. But I was laughing at in this sad moment when you think about John McCain's happy moments and the happy warrior that he was. Chad Pergram, in that image of I saw that maybe 1,000 times. John McCain like almost punching this little old button that, you know, that Richard Russell put in 1962 or something. That, come on, Subway, go faster, go faster. And he just was impatient. And look, impatience can be a good thing when you want to get things done. Impatience can be a difficult thing when, you know, maybe a little bit of taking a step back. And he knew that. He understood that sometimes he pushed a little hard.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, as we look at the screen, you know, of the hearse carrying the body of Senator McCain, it is certainly a very sad evening for Cindy McCain, and in terms of their marriage, it's kind of interesting, Ed. I mean, she always seemed to be at his side. Certainly, when he was running for president, she was on the trail with him, always, you know, looking stunning, always right there next to him, and his daughter loyal also to him. The women in his life appear to be very loyal to him. You can see them right there saluting as the hearse goes by, carrying the body of the now deceased Senator John McCain.
And one of the things with Cindy McCain, when you mention her, and rightly so, is that she's not just the wife of. When he was a candidate for re-election, when he was a candidate for president, she wasn't just the wife of. I've gotten to know her a little bit. She works very hard on, you know, going and fighting child trafficking all around the world, for example. It's a cause deep in her heart and soul. And so she didn't just rest on her laurels and want to be a spouse of. She's somebody who has also been in the arena and has fought very valiantly, I think, on these important public policy issues. And I mention that as well at this moment because at some point, after a few days, talk is obviously going to turn to what happens next, and the governor, the Republican governor, is going to appoint someone on a temporary basis to take the seat. And I mention it because Cindy McCain's name has come up, and she's somebody who may be interested in that seat, again, at an appropriate time after she's had a chance to mourn. But that
is very interesting. And, you know, I think that people would be comfortable with that concept, given the fact that she was so much a part of his life. She wasn't someone who distanced herself from politics or from the senator. And she's someone who, you know, knows Arizona and has lived there and knows the issues, certainly has lived the issues. And you know what? You have to also recognize that a woman who has lived with a man like John McCain, you know, and who lived with the stories of his POW and you know, his history as a fighter pilot, and then all of the other components of his career that she was a part of, she is one knowledgeable woman.
Tough cookie herself.
Oh, and, I'm sure she had to be.
To put up with John McCain, as he would be the first to say all of these years. Because as I said, he would talk about his temper in the Senate hallways and say, I know sometimes I let it get the best of me, but I just get so fired up, and he'd start throwing those fists down. I mentioned Mitch McConnell earlier in some of the battles, and they became friends in later years, but it was largely over, they had fights over campaign finance reform. Mitch McConnell did not want those limits on contributions that John McCain got. Mitch McConnell, more of a conservative view that you should not have any limits, just full transparency. If somebody wants to give $1 million to a Senate campaign, disclose it. So they had their policy battles. And one other quick thing, remember in the 2008 campaign when he was struggling against Barack Obama, and the economy was in a free fall. I was covering the McCain campaign, not the Obama campaign. And I remember one day being in New York City and all of a sudden hearing John McCain has abruptly suspended his campaign because he said, I'm getting off the trail. The economy is falling apart. I'm going back to Washington because we're going to have an important meeting at the White House to figure all this out. And we're going to come together. He said, I hope that Barack Obama is the Democratic nominee and I can come together with George W. Bush. And I spoke to then Speaker John Boehner many years later, and he told me that it was the darndest thing because McCain announced this. Everyone in the Republican House and Senate thought there must be a grand plan behind this,
yes,
right?
Yes.
And so Boehner calls him and says, McCain, what the heck's going on? What next? And McCain literally said to Boehner, according to Boehner, I don't know. What do you think I should do? And he said, you just suspended the entire campaign. And then they got to the White House, and McCain didn't really have a plan, and Barack Obama ended up debating him back and forth with George W. Bush mediating. And I mentioned that not to rain on his parade, but to point out that he knew in later years he would talk about he was impulsive and he wasn't perfect, and none of us are. And John McCain knew it.
And that's what made him charming. Anyway, we're going to wrap my coverage this evening on justice of the passing of Senator John McCain. But before we do, I believe that Peter Ducey is going to join us from Washington, and then John Scott will be taking over at 10 p.m. Peter?
Judge Janine, John McCain was the first person who gave me an opportunity to ask them a question, a political question, on TV. It was 2008. I was a junior at Villanova University, and he was right in the midst. He had already locked up the Republican nomination for president, but the Obama versus Clinton fight there in Pennsylvania, where I was a college student, was still really going strong. And so he came onto the stage there at the pavilion at Villanova University, and he was going to get interviewed by Chris Matthews. An MSNBC producer came around and asked me if I had any questions. And that morning, earlier on the front page of the newspaper there in Philadelphia, was a picture of Hillary Clinton with a whiskey shot. And she was toasting some voters, and I thought that it was a funny photo. It was getting a lot of play there on the college campus, and so I thought it would be nice to ask Senator McCain if he wanted to go out for a shot with me. And a producer came around and said, hey, anybody have any questions for the senator? I said, yeah, I would like to ask a question. And I told him, I said I would like to ask if he thinks that Secretary, or I guess then Senator Clinton, was just drinking the shots because she was trailing Obama at the time. And then I asked him if he wanted to go out, and I told him I wanted to ask if he wanted to go out for a shot with me. They said, okay, that's great. You will go second. And so I asked him the question live on TV, and he just laughed, and he paused, and he had this great reaction, and he collected himself, and he eventually got around to saying that it was one of the two best questions that he had had throughout the entire campaign. And for a college junior, that is something that was so cool to hear, and it is something that I still think about all of the time. And it's also the reason that I got interested in political journalism, and that I let the LSAT books that I had from Barnes & Noble there in the main line in Pennsylvania start collecting dust, and I never pursued a career as a lawyer. And years later, it's been almost 10 years since then, I had the great pleasure of seeing Senator McCain a lot on Capitol Hill, and he loved to tell that story to other journalists that were there. And he would say, he would come up to me and he would put his arm around me and he would say to the other gathered photographers and producers and writers and reporters, he would say, what this little jerk or what this little punk did? And he would tell the story about me asking this crazy question in college. But he always made sure to know that if he was calling a little jerk, calling somebody a little jerk or a little punk, it's because he had a lot of great admiration for them. Senator McCain, until the end, was the Senate Armed Services Committee chairman. He was the person that you would want to go to anytime that there was anything going on, whether it was an outside the Senate scandal, something going on with the floor, and he never once walked away from us. Not everybody always wants to take a question on the Hill. Senator McCain always did, and we're going to miss him a lot there in the hallways, because he was the one who always gave us the best information of anybody, and he had the best insight based on decades of experience. Back to you.
Peter Doocy in Washington. Peter, thank you. I'm John Scott in New York, where it is 10 p.m., 7 p.m. now in Arizona, and we are continuing to follow breaking news right now. If you're just joining us, we're remembering the life and legacy of Arizona Senator, war hero, and former presidential candidate John McCain. The longtime senator died tonight at the age of 81 after a battle with brain cancer that lasted more than a year. President Trump offering his deepest sympathies and respect to the McCain family tonight as the nation remembers a legendary figure in American politics. Joining me now to talk about John McCain's life and legacy, former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee. Governor, thanks for being here. You competed against John McCain. You also campaigned with John McCain. Tell us your fondest memory.
Well, the fondest memory wasn't when he beat me, John, I will tell you that, but it was never personal. In fact, John McCain really was able to defeat me in South Carolina. That was the turning point. I was really getting some momentum up until that time. He had decided that if he didn't win South Carolina, he was pulling out because he was about out of gas, out of money, and so that was really the critical moment. He and Fred Thompson had a great plan. The plan was that Fred would stay in the race. He was ready to get out. Fred would stay in and basically drive back and forth between Greenville and Spartanburg and beat the stuffing out of me every day. And that's where my strength was. McCain's strength was down in the low country in Charleston. It was a very effective strategy. We still thought we might pull it off. John McCain ended up winning South Carolina, went on to win the nomination. But it was one of those things that people said, did that make you upset that they, had that strategy? I said, no, I admired them. It was a brilliant political strategy. It was honorable. There was nothing untoward about it. There was nothing unseemly or unethical. It was just good, strong, hardball politics. It's what we all get into this business to do. And, I always thought that was a smart and shrewd move. And it was the reason that he ended up being the nominee. And he and I got along great. I did campaign with him and for him vigorously throughout the rest of the 2008 campaign. Never had a regret about that, and was proud to be able to give him my support in 2008.
I was struck in reading his biography that he actually replaced Senator Barry Goldwater in the U.S. Senate. He had served a couple of terms in the House before then, but in '86 he was elected to the Senate to replace Barry Goldwater, obviously an Arizona senator and a conservative icon, a former presidential candidate himself. And Senator Goldwater was a stalwart of the conservative cause. I think he was often unfairly maligned because, they go back to the '64 campaign with Lyndon Johnson, and, there were so many things that were thrown at him. But he was an honorable man and a man of deep principle and conviction. And I think that there was a lot of that rubbed off on Senator McCain. He was a person who clearly listened to his own counsel. He believed in what he believed, and he stood by it. If it made him the one sheep out of the 100 in the fold that sort of went the other way, he could be the prodigal. But he did it not just to be different. I think he did it because he truly believed that what he was doing was the right thing. And if it bothered everybody, even his closest friends, he still did it. And you have to have some admiration for a person who has the depth of his own convictions, that he's willing to do that. And one thing I did see in Senator McCain on the campaign trail, a very close relationship with his family. And, you get to know people better off the stage than on the stage, in the campaign bus and backstage. It's where you find out what people really are all about. And I was always struck by the extraordinary level of love and respect that his children had for him. And I really think of all the things that can be said about a person, the people who know him best, if they love him most,
that probably says a whole lot more than his political opponents or the editorial writers or the commentators or the talking heads, many of whom maybe have crossed paths, but never really had that kind of intimacy that his family had.
Governor Mike Huckabee, it's good to have your insights. Thanks for joining us this evening. We appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
So once again, a little more than, I guess a little less than 36 hours after it was announced yesterday morning that John McCain would be foregoing any further medical treatment for the aggressive brain cancer that ultimately took his life. The end for the senator came at 4:28 this evening in Arizona time. That was about 7:28 Eastern time. John McCain succumbed to cancer at the age of 81. Joining us now, Kelly Ayotte, senator who worked with Senator McCain, obviously in the Senate, until, well, just about a year and a half ago. Senator Ayotte, it's good to have you here. So many of us, knew that the end was coming, but John McCain was such a fixture on the national scene, 6 terms in the U.S. Senate. It's hard to believe he's gone.
It really is. It's a very, very sad day. He was a dear friend of mine, and, I served on the Armed Services Committee with him. He was the chair of that committee, and, I mean, his devotion to our military, his leadership, his courage, we all know of his sacrifice, not only in Vietnam, but his whole family served. His son served in the military, and he's just an incredible example of an extraordinary person who's lived his life with courage, loved this country, a great patriot, and it's a huge loss for us.
He spent 6 years, almost 6 years, as a prisoner of war in Vietnam, was tortured there very badly in the Hanoi Hilton, 3 years in solitary confinement. It nearly cost him the use of his arms. I mean, he was severely crippled as a result of the torture that he endured there and the aircraft shoot down that resulted in his capture. And yet at the same time, he was one of those who pushed to end the embargo on Vietnam in the 1990s. I think that says an awful lot about the forgiveness that was in his heart and, well, just the fact that he was able to move on from a terrible experience.
Yeah, I had the privilege of traveling to Vietnam with him, and I can tell you that the way he is received now by the Vietnamese people is incredible. Think about what he went through there, the sacrifice that he made for our country. He was asked to go home. He said no. I mean, the fortitude that took, what it took for him to stay there when he's being tortured. He's just, the courage that he showed, he showed that throughout his life, but it also, I think it made him very appreciative of life and very appreciative of people. He always stood up for people's human rights and their dignity. And that was something I think that was very important to him, and probably going back to his experience as a prisoner of war. And you think about what it took to be able to survive through that. He every day he got up with that kind of grit and fortitude, and every issue he approached it with that kind of determination.
I know he had served for some time in the Senate when you arrived there. Was he one of those who gave you any advice about what it's like to work in that institution?
Yes, he did, because as I said, I served on the Armed Services Committee with him. He was the chairman of that committee, and such a strong voice for our country on national security and for our military. And yeah, he gave me advice, and it was always really straight. He always said, I'll tell you, and I saw him this year when he was ill, and you know what he told me? He said, do the right thing. He's like, that will work out, and even if people disagree with you, you got to do what you think is right in your heart. And he never strayed away from a fight. He said, if you believe in something, you got to stand up for it, and you got to fight for it.
Let me read a statement from the Republican National Committee on his passing. They write, "We mourn the passing of a true American patriot, Senator John McCain." This is from the chairwoman, Ronna McDaniel. Senator McCain dedicated his life to serving his country both during his time in Congress and in combat in the U.S. Navy. He was an advocate for American leadership in the world and a tireless champion of our nation's troops and veterans. We at the RNC are praying for the entire McCain family at this difficult time. There are many in Washington who talk about veterans, who talk about the troops, but there aren't that many who have lived that life and experienced frontline combat the way Senator McCain did.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think he's a one-of-a-kind, extraordinary, just an extraordinary leader. He leaves a tremendous legacy, and he not only, talked the talk, but he really walked the walk when it came to our veterans. I mean, I traveled with him to many war-torn areas, and there wasn't, wherever there was a troop, John would go and visit them, their families. When he ran for president, he would meet regularly with the families of those who were killed in Iraq and other conflicts. And he used to carry on, he would wear a bracelet with the name of a soldier who was killed from New Hampshire in the line of duty. And that's how much it meant to him. It really, to his core, he's a patriot, and the military and their families were very important to him.
He was, of course, a two-time presidential candidate, lost the Republican nomination to the man who went on to become president, George W. Bush, then ran again in 2008 and competed and for a time was leading in the race against Barack Obama, the senator at the time from Illinois. Barack Obama has just released this statement, and let me read it for you now. John McCain and I were members of different generations, came from completely different backgrounds, and competed at the highest level of politics. But we shared, for all our differences, a fidelity to something higher, the ideals for which generations of Americans and immigrants alike have fought, marched, and sacrificed. We saw our political battles, even as a privilege, something noble, an opportunity to serve as stewards of those high ideals at home and to advance them around the world. We saw this country as a place where anything is possible, and citizenship is our patriotic obligation to ensure it forever remains that way. Few of us have been tested the way John once was, or required to show the kind of courage that he did, but all of us can aspire to the courage that put the greater good above our own. At John's best, he showed us what that means, and for that we are all in his debt. Michelle and I send our most heartfelt condolences to Cindy and their family. Once again, that's the statement from former President Barack Obama. John McCain, after he lost that race to then Senator Obama, was pretty gracious in victory. In defeat. It was a hard-fought campaign, Senator, and perhaps you can shed a little light on that.
Well, what I can say is, and of course, coming from New Hampshire, John came back twice to win the New Hampshire primary when people thought that his campaign was over. So he really had a special relationship with my state when it came to presidential politics. And I will tell you that for John, it's the kind of dignity that he had. After he lost that campaign, he wanted to bring the country together and heal the country. And, it's tough. I can imagine losing a presidential campaign and putting your heart into it, but John thought it was more important to bring people together, and that is the type of leader that he was.
Kelly Ayotte, former senator from New Hampshire. Senator Ayotte, it's good to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
We just had some of the video of Senator John McCain up. Ed Henry's still with us. Ed's spent a long time in Washington covering various branches of our government, including the Senate. Interesting there to see Senator Joe Lieberman there behind McCain. They were very close, different parties, but very close.
I remember being at the Republican convention in St. Paul in 2008, and Joe Lieberman, as a Democrat, very nearly became the vice presidential nominee. John McCain, in later years, said he regretted not picking him. There was concern among his brain trust that as a pro-choice Democrat who had been on the ticket, of course, with Al Gore just 8 years earlier in 2000, that he would lose the conservative base. And John McCain, frankly, felt, I should have rolled the dice. I lost anyway. I listened to all the smart people about what I should have done, woulda, coulda, shoulda. I'm also thinking about, I covered that 2008 campaign on the McCain side. And you're absolutely right that he was gracious, because in the final days of that campaign, I remember a moment, and I believe it was in Wisconsin, but it was in the Midwest. And you know, you have these candidates and they're tired and they know they're likely to lose in the final days, and you know, when they're on the losing end of it, and they might do multiple events and they're tired and they're worn out. And someone came talked to him at a town hall and started disparaging Barack Obama and questioning his nationality. And maybe another candidate who was losing and thought maybe this would help him in the polls might have piled on. But John McCain said, no, no, no. He's an American, and I just have a disagreement. And he has a good family. He's a good family man. I just have a disagreement on policy. I just have a different vision of America. I recall him generally saying that. And it was a brave, courageous moment for John McCain to, amid all of these rumors and attacks and everything else, to say, no, Barack Obama's a good man. I just have a disagreement with him. And I think he brought that warrior spirit. And when you hear Senator Ayotte talk about him going back, and she served with him in the Senate, I remember when he came back in 2009 to the Senate, and I and others asked him, you know, did you think about retiring? Did you think about walking away? Some people in defeat would say, heck with it. I'm going to go back to the ranch in Arizona. And you mentioned his lifetime of service. He served America for 60 years, going back not just to the Senate, but his military service. He had a grandfather, Admiral John McCain Sr., a 1906 Naval Academy graduate, and his father, also a Navy admiral, Admiral John McCain Jr., earned the Silver Star during World War II. And John McCain said something to me about how both his father and grandfather, when they retired from the Navy, died very quickly. They no longer had a mission. They no longer had a vocation. And he wanted to stay in the fight, and that's why he kept running again. Some in the conservative base felt like he had abandoned them, didn't like him in later years, felt like, you know, the Obamacare vote that he split with President Trump on. There were some tense moments, but he wanted to go back to the Senate and fight for his principles.
There is a destroyer, the John McCain, prowling the Pacific right now, that is named after his father and his grandfather as well. A ship that is quite a thing to behold.
Yeah, and you know, his mother is still alive, Roberta McCain, 106 years old.
Wow.
And Lindsey Graham tells the story that a few years ago, I believe in her 90s or right around 100 years old, against her son's wishes, she went on a European vacation and wanted to rent a car. And I don't know if it's Hertz or Alamo, I don't want to disparage the company, but this is according to Lindsey Graham, and he'll tell the story, I'm sure, when he comes on. Lindsey Graham says that Roberta McCain tried to rent a car, and they said, I'm sorry, ma'am, but you're too old. That basically we have rules and liability and all of that. You can't rent the car. And she wanted to take this car through various countries around Europe against her son's wishes and others' wishes. And she finally turned to the rental car person and said, how much is the car? They got her a price, and she said, I'm buying it. And so she bought the car and traveled around Europe with that car. So my point is that John McCain, and we got to know Meghan McCain really well here at Fox, Cindy McCain, the entire family, these are people who I think are strong. And he's had a tough battle, a tough fight in recent months. And you wonder, where does Meghan McCain, where does John McCain get that toughness, that spunk? Yes, his father and grandfather, Navy admirals, but his mother, who's still alive, 106, pretty tough woman as well.
The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Frank Donatelli is joining us now. He was senior campaign advisor to John McCain. Was that in the, Frank, tell us about that experience. I'm sorry.
That was right. That was 2008. And then I moved over to the Republican National Committee to be Senator McCain's person at the RNC for the last 6 months of the campaign. Well, the campaign lasted almost 2 years, and I think we were ahead for 10 days. But Senator McCain was the happy warrior always working very, very hard. I think the one thing I remember was from early in the campaign. This was when President Bush had announced the surge to try to save the American effort in Iraq, and everybody was walking away from that. Not McCain. He doubled down and supported the Bush surge, and he would give speeches across the country. And basically what he said was, I don't mind losing an election, but I don't want America to ever lose a war. And that's how he began the campaign, and that's the way he he brought his candidacy to the American people, and it's how he conducted himself always.
He came into political office during the Reagan Revolution, but it's my understanding that he actually opposed President Reagan's plan to send the Marines to Lebanon because he felt like they were too few in number and would not be able to, amount to anything as a fighting force. And, given what later happened at the Marine barracks, it was a very prescient observation.
Yes, well, he did. That was his position, and he turned out to be correct. I think in retrospect, that's exactly what happened. The Marines were sort of holed up in a barracks, and they had no mission besides just keeping the warring factions apart. And we had the terrible blast that killed over 250 Marines. But again, I think that's John McCain, even his good friend Ronald Reagan, somebody he admired. He was willing to stand up and speak about, especially national security issues, if it was something that he believed in very strongly.
Ed Henry was just telling us the story about how Senator McCain felt that his father and grandfather both died early and too young once they left the service because, they sort of didn't have a mission anymore. That's Ed's story, not mine, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. His time in public service, did that energize him? Did that prolong him?
Well, I think the really fascinating thing about Senator McCain is he had the ability never to look back. So he obviously had a lot of setbacks in life. His time being a prisoner of war, being treated so brutally as some of your colleagues were talking about, and yet when he's in the Senate 20 years later, he's able to put all that aside and support President Clinton in normalizing relations with Vietnam because he felt it was in the national interest. And if you had to encapsulate what he believed, it came in the second campaign, 2008. The title of the campaign was Country First. I mean, you can disagree. He disagreed with members of his own party, but it was never nefarious and it was never for poor reasons. It was always because he honestly believed that the stand he was taking was in the best interest of the United States, and that was always his touchstone.
Frank Donatelli. Frank, it's good to have your memories tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Grant Woods is joining us. He was Attorney General in Arizona in the 1990s, but also was Chief of Staff to John McCain when he was a congressman. Grant, thanks for being here tonight.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
When he spent 2 terms as a member of Congress before moving on to the Senate. Did you know that this man was going to have the kind of political career that ultimately he had? 6 terms in the Senate and 2 runs for president?
Well, I think from pretty much day one, our goal was to get John to the Senate. He belonged there. It was foremost on our mind. So I think that was our early goal. And when I first met John McCain, right after he moved here to Arizona, I'm a native Arizonan. I, like everybody else, I was like, who is this guy? He's just moving here and he's going to run for Congress. And I met him and I walked out of the meeting and immediately thought, wow, this guy is amazing. And I was for him and thought, yeah, he could go all the way, not just the United States Senate, but wherever he wanted to go.
Let's talk a little bit about what happens now. It's my understanding that under Arizona law, the person who replaces him will be appointed by the governor, and that person has to be a Republican. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's correct. That's what our law says.
And so that his term will expire in 2022. So another 4 years for whomever the governor chooses.
Well, I think the way the law reads is the governor will appoint, and that person will serve until the next election. There's not enough time for this election, so that means that seat will come up in 2020. And I gather, I guess it would be for 2 years, and then they'd have to run again. So that's what we're looking at. So it'll be a governor's appointment within the same party to go to the next regular election, which would be 2020.
So there's, there are going to be two new senators from the state of Arizona. Jeff Flake is retiring. John McCain has now passed away as of this evening. There are some who say that this could be an opportunity for a Democratic pickup. Do you see that?
Yeah, I definitely see that. I think that's a very real possibility as far as the Jeff Flake seat. I think they have an excellent candidate, and we'll see who the Republicans nominate on Tuesday. So I think that's a real possibility.
It's been a long time since Arizona was represented by a Democrat, but I guess we'll see what the election brings.
Right. We've elected Democrats statewide, though. In our recent history, Governor Napolitano was elected twice, and Attorney General Terry Goddard was elected twice statewide. So Arizona, in a presidential year when everybody turns out, is actually fairly moderate in my view.
There has been some discussion of the possibility that Cindy McCain might be interested in taking the seat that her husband held. Do you see that as a possibility?
Well, here's the thing. Those of us, John's been one of my closest friends for all that time, since 1982. And I think those of us around him have just refused to even talk about any of that all along the way here. And the governor, to his credit, has really chastised people who have gone out and started, campaigning or speculating about that. The governor's handled himself, as you would expect, with, great integrity. And so, I think we'll just give that some time, and I'm sure the governor will do the right thing here and appoint a great person to the spot.
So let's talk about your memories of this man who, as you say, was one of your close friends. I interviewed him a couple of times. I would read stories about him. He had the reputation, the nickname of the Maverick. But as a politician, as a political leader, tell us who he was.
Well, he was a maverick, that's for sure. I mean, to know John was to know that was his first instinct always, and that was kind of in life, not just in politics. If you tell him to go walk this way, he'd walk the other way. And I've talked to people who knew him in high school, and nothing's changed. It's been pretty much the same. So that he was, but as far as a leader, I don't know. I just think he's been such a great voice for America and for the strength of America and why we're unique. I think some people, some politicians, some leaders, they don't really believe America is that unique. We're kind of like Europe. We're like any place else. And John McCain was always the strong voice for people who are just seeking freedom from around the world. He believed what we believe, that every person has the right to be free, not because of government, but because that's what God gave us, that right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But John didn't just talk about it. He stood side by side and never forgot the people around the world who were just seeking what we take for granted sometimes, and that's their basic freedom. So I think the role of America in the world, the role of us with our allies, to be that shining city on the hill. He believed it, and hopefully people will get back to that and remember that we are a special country, but we're only special if we keep ourselves special.
Tammy Duckworth served with John McCain in the Senate. She still is there as a Democrat from the state of Illinois. Yeah. She put out a news release or a statement this evening. And it was interesting. I hadn't known this. She said when she was a legless helicopter pilot, having been shot down in Iraq, she met John McCain for the first time while she was recovering at Walter Reed Hospital. He joked, she writes, that he and I both flew into a missile, and that didn't take much skill. It's what you do afterwards that matters. And that's part of the statement from Senator Tammy Duckworth. Go ahead.
That's great. Well, he was always very self-effacing and had a tremendous sense of humor. I'm going to miss that. That's one of the main things I'm going to miss is just the daily jokes and, you know, just having fun. But that doesn't surprise me. And I think that's another thing people probably underestimate. I know so many senators, Republicans and Democrats, whose worldview has been shaped by John McCain. He's taken them under his wing. His Armed Services Committee has been notoriously bipartisan. He gives everybody their voice. He takes them on trips. And even the liberal Democrats come away from that, not necessarily agreeing on policy across the board with John, obviously, but having a better understanding of why it's important for our country to stand up for the cause of freedom around the world. And I could give you a list of names of senators who I know their worldview has been shaped by their tutelage and their experiences with Senator John McCain.
Grant Woods joining us now. He was chief of staff for John McCain when he was a congressman, also attorney general in Arizona for 8 years in the 90s. Grant, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.
So it was just a little over 3 hours ago that the longtime senator from Arizona, John McCain, left this world. 4:28 Arizona time, he died at his home in his beloved Sedona, Arizona. Alicia Acuna is joining us now. She's outside the Arizona State House. Alicia?
Hi, John, and you can see over my shoulders, it's backlit a little bit. The flags were lowered to half staff in pretty short order after the announcement came that Senator John McCain had left this earth. And then we started to see the outpouring of love for the family and the honoring of a man, a true American hero. Governor Doug Ducey putting out a statement saying John McCain is one American who will never be forgotten. He was a giant, an icon, an American hero. But here at home, we were most proud to call him a fellow Arizonan. Now, we've heard that a lot tonight, right? That he was a hero and an icon, a formidable rival. But he was also a dad, and he was also a husband. And there are 7 of his children who are mourning tonight. And his wife, Cindy, put out a statement pretty quickly on Twitter saying that her heart is broken. My heart is broken. I am so lucky to have lived the adventure of loving this incredible man for 38 years. He passed the way he lived, on his own terms, surrounded by the people he loved in the place he loved best. And you just mentioned that, John, his ranch just south of Sedona that he did love so very much. And we were talking earlier on the Fox Report how I'd had this conversation with former Arizona Senator John Kyle. They served in the Senate together for 18 years, and he said, we did a lot. We got a lot done. We traveled to places. And at the moment, this was before his passing, he had said that there really wasn't much silver in this cloud, but what there was that he was in a place that was his most favorite on earth, and that is this ranch where he loved to barbecue, which we've been hearing about tonight. He loved the sound of the creek, the water that was there, and he loved to watch the little animals and the things, the hawks or the eagles that would chase their little dog. All of that meant so very much to him, and that is the place where he was receiving family and friends and the people who were by his side, including Meghan McCain, his daughter, who we've been talking about tonight because she was part of the Fox family for such a long time and so special to so many people at Fox. And she also put out a statement talking about her father and saying that, I was with my father at his end as he was with me at my beginning. In the 33 years we shared together, he raised me, taught me, corrected me, comforted me, encouraged me, and supported me in all things. He loved me and I loved him. He taught me how to live. his life and his care, ever present, always unfailing, took me from a girl to a woman, and he showed me what it is to be a man. Now, as I mentioned, she was by his side at their ranch in Cornville, Arizona. That's the ranch south of Sedona. And it wasn't too long after, actually, that we did see a motorcade leave the ranch. It was an extensive motorcade. We saw the hearse carrying the body of Senator John McCain and departing that area. At this point, we don't have firm plans yet. Of course, we know that they have been made, but right now the expectation is that there will be some services here in Arizona and then also back east. Now, we talk about some of the tradition and also the way that John McCain sort of treated tradition if he just wasn't agreeing with it. And as you know, his father and his grandfather both buried at Arlington National Cemetery. However, Senator McCain has expressed his desire at one point that he actually be buried at his alma mater, the Navy Academy at Annapolis, hoping to do that. We are awaiting word to see if that is actually the way that things will go. But John, of course, doesn't that just sound like a maverick?
Does indeed. Alicia Acuna there in Arizona, where Senator McCain passed away this evening. Alicia, thank you. President Trump didn't always see eye to eye with John McCain and vice versa. But we have a statement from the president. This one that I have says, my deepest sympathies and respect go out to the family of Senator John McCain. Our hearts and prayers are with you. Also, this statement from President George W. Bush. He says, some lives are so vivid it is difficult to imagine them ended. Some voices are so vibrant it is hard to think of them still. John McCain was a man of deep conviction and a patriot of the highest order. He was a public servant in the finest traditions of our country, and to me he was a friend whom I'll deeply miss. Laura and I send our heartfelt sympathies to Cindy and the entire McCain family, and our thanks to God for the life of John McCain. That statement from President George W. Bush, Bush 43. Ed Henry is still with us. Again, a guy who has covered Washington for a long time, knows a great deal about the institutions. He has not voted since December 7th, ironically Pearl Harbor Day.
Yeah.
So it's been about 2/3 of a year that he's been out of the chamber. Of course, everybody remembers that he was really the deciding vote on derailing Republican efforts to kind of undo Obamacare.
Repeal Obamacare.
Yeah.
They were successful later, of course, in repealing the individual mandate of Obamacare, which is sort of the heart and soul of it. But, you know, President Trump, as you mentioned a moment ago, has been direct about being out there at some of these political rallies in recent weeks and months in saying, I know we shouldn't talk about this, I'm not going to go on and on, John McCain is not well right now, but I'm not happy about that vote. And so he's been direct about that. And frankly, John McCain was direct about his distaste for the president, particularly on national security and foreign policy in the early days of 2017. He challenged this administration, and that gets at the maverick image, as you mentioned. And frankly, there are a lot of the president's allies who were quite frustrated with how John McCain approached this president. And so, look, he was someone who lived a full life. And let's not forget and gloss over that when you read that statement from George W. Bush, there were some bitter moments in the 2000 campaign, as I'm sure you remember. And John McCain and Cindy McCain were not happy about rumors of personal nature and other things that came up in that campaign that they accused the Bush campaign and other Republicans of spreading. And the bottom line is that Barack Obama put out this wonderful statement as well tonight, and rightly so, because I don't want to diminish the fact that John McCain and Barack Obama did have a friendship despite their political differences. But I also recall covering President Obama in, I believe, 2009 when he was fighting it out over health care. And John McCain was standing up to a Democratic president, not just President Trump in later years. And Barack Obama kind of snapped at John McCain. You remember that video moment where he said, you know, John, the election is over and I won, basically, and your idea. And that was a petulant moment from Barack Obama. Let's not forget that, as Democrats tonight say, oh, Barack Obama and Joe Biden are saying warm things and Donald Trump is at odds with John McCain. John McCain, as I said, lived a full life, threw a lot of elbows around, going back to his Navy days, 60 years of service all told between the military, the U.S. House, the Senate. And I mentioned a few moments ago, I checked while you were talking to other guests, his grandfather, who was a Navy Admiral, John McCain Sr., was on the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945, when the Japanese surrendered. And as I suggested, Senator McCain had told me he died 4 days later as he left the service. And John McCain's father, Admiral John McCain Jr., earned the Silver Star during World War II. He died in a military aircraft over the North Atlantic as his own service in the Navy was ending. Wow. And so I mentioned that because John McCain was open in his later years about talking about how he had political opponents that wanted to see him retire. And he said, you're gonna have to deal with me for a lot longer, Ed. You're gonna have to deal with me. And you know, Peter Ducey made this point earlier. You'd go up to him in the hallway and want to ask him a question, and he'd say, Ed Henry, you jerk. What do you want? and as Grant Woods was saying a moment ago, it was just a sense of humor. He was tough, he was rough, but he liked to also spar with you. And he did that with President Trump, he did that with Barack Obama, and he did it with reporters.
Douglas Holtz-Eakins was an economic advisor to the senator's campaign for president in 2008, and Doug is good enough to join us now. Douglas, this was a remarkable American. You know, I was on the air yesterday morning when we learned that he had decided to forego treatment for any further, any further treatment for his brain cancer. And you knew then that the end was coming soon, but I guess I just didn't think it would be this soon, less than 36 hours later. Your thoughts, Doug?
Well, I think there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have seen in the past days say it was the great honor of their lives to work for John McCain, and I'm one of those, and this brings it home. You know, you never thought it would end, and the ending is very sad. But, you know, he faced a terrible diagnosis with great courage as he lived his entire life, and he was an inspiration to us all for a very simple reason. You know, he's widely understood to have said it's important to live for something that's more important than yourself, some greater cause. And the thing I always remember about him is he got you to do that. I did my best work for John McCain, and it took me a long time to realize it was because it wasn't for John McCain, because I bought into the notion that there was a greater cause, and it was worth the extra effort, it was worth the time away from your family, it was worth whatever it took to get it done. And he was that kind of guy. He inspired that in everyone around him. And I'm just privileged to have been one of the few who got to do that.
Were you with the campaign? Ed was telling us the story, reminding me, frankly, that he left the campaign trail for a time during the 2008 campaign because of the economic crisis, and he thought it was important to go back to Washington. Were you on the campaign at that time, and what transpired then, if so?
I had organized a briefing for then Senator John McCain, a presidential candidate in New York, and quite frankly, the folks who talked to him, whether they were now NEC Director Larry Kudlow, Meg Whitman, John Taylor, esteemed academic from Harvard, you know, a variety of Wall Street leaders, and what they told him was the world is ending, and it was one of the most frightening and apocalyptic briefings one could face. And to his credit, John walked away from that terribly disturbed, and from a political point of view, he made a huge mistake. He forgot that he was running for president, decided to be a senator again and go back to D.C. and get something done. Of course, that wasn't going to happen. There was no way the Democrats were going to let him go back to D.C. and be the hero. But I've always admired him for, in that moment, forgetting his ambitions and remembering that the country